Hi, this is Andre. I want to talk about Multiply on the Echoplex Digital Pro. In the most basic sense, Multiply lets you record an initial loop and then multiply it out to several times its original length. So the most basic application for Multiply is that you can overdub phrases on top of your initial loop that are longer than the initial loop length was. Let's go through the Multiply process again, and let's take a slightly closer look at what's going on. I'm going to start a new loop from scratch. I'm going to make a little longer loop because I want to be able to point out a few things. So here's my longer loop. Okay, so that's an initial loop. Now let's multiply it out to 4 times the length. I'm going to hit multiply the first time, and as I do that, a display is going to start up here showing us how many multiples we have. Here we go, pressing multiply. So now we're in the second multiple, third multiply, close it here in the fourth multiple, and there we've got our 4 multiples. Now in Echoplex terminology, each of these multiples is actually called a cycle. For right now, it's fine to think of cycles and multiples as being the same thing. When we get into other functions related to things like insert, there'll be a reason to make a distinction between multiples and cycles, but for right now, don't worry about any of that. For right now, just think of this as being a cycle, which is, for right now, the same as a multiple. Now to activate multiply, you hit the multiply button a first time. Let me do that again. Here's our initial loop. As soon as I press multiply, it starts. And it starts counting off new multiples of the initial loop length. When I press multiply a second time, we have what's called the rounding period. The rounding period is the time between when you press multiply a second time to stop it and when it gets to the end of whatever cycle it's currently in. So let me demonstrate that again. Here's an initial loop length. Now I press a first time to start multiply, and now this is the rounding period. Now the reason the rounding period is good to be aware of is because you have options as far as whether or not you continue adding material into the loop after you hit multiply. In other words, you can decide whether or not anything is added to the loop content during the rounding period. Here's our initial loop. So now I'm going to overdub on top of it. Here's the rounding period here. So you can hear all this stuff was added into the loop. The lines that I played after the round period, you can hear that's not in there because the round mode is set to off. If we come down here to the second parameter row and go into the multiply column and examine round mode, right now we have it off. That means that anything that we play after the rounding period, anything that we play during the rounding period will not be added to the loop. Let's talk about that again. Initial loop. Start multiplying. And those little hits of the open E, the second note, that stuff did not get added in because round mode was off. So now, to contrast that, let's switch round mode on. So now, here's our generic open string initial loop. Now if I hit multiply, here's the rounding period. And you can hear here. Now the little thing that I played, that part, was added into the loop, even though I was in the rounding period because round mode had been set to round. Now you can also use overdub as an alternate ending to force a round mode, even if rounding is set to off. By default, I usually have it set to off, but that's because if I do want to continue overdubbing material into the loop during the rounding period, I can end multiply with overdub. So here's a demonstration. There's our initial loop length, multiply out. And then you'll hear that those little muted last 4 notes. Here we go. That stuff was added in even though round mode is off because I ended multiply with overdub. So if you use overdub as an alternate ending to multiply, it will automatically round to the near end of the nearest multiple, and it will also allow you to overdub material in the rounding period even if round mode is off. Now let's talk about the idea of a remultiply. Remultiply has to do with the idea that you can keep adding or subtracting cycles after you've recorded your loop. So in the most basic sense, let's expand this to an 8-cycle loop. I'm going to press multiply here. Now I'm going to add. And here comes the 8th cycle. Close it here. Now we have an 8-cycle loop, and you can hear the higher harmonic overdubs that I just added in there, and you're going to hear that it gets cut off in the 8th cycle because round mode is off and I ended with multiply. Here we go. There you go, it got cut off. You can also remultiply down to a smaller number of cycles. Let's say we want to change this into a 3-cycle loop. So we're going to start multiply wherever we want to have the beginning of the new loop be. 2nd cycle, 3rd cycle. Stop multiply within the 3rd cycle, and now it's a 3-cycle loop. Let's say I want to go down to a 1-cycle loop. Multiply, multiply again. Now maybe we want to expand this out to a 2-cycle loop, but we want to add a new layer on top of it. So I'm going to press multiply. I'm going to hit multiply a 2nd time while we're in the 2nd cycle, and I'm going to overdub new material on top. And so forth. And then we can remultiply that out to as many multiples as we want until we run out of Echoplex memory. So I'm going to hit multiply. Sounds like a good place to stop. And then we can remultiply again. In that case, we're back down to 1 cycle. And so on and so forth. Let's talk briefly about multiply as an alternate ending to record. If you want to go straight from recording your initial loop into multiply, you can do that by ending record with multiply. Now we're already multiplying. So that's a nice way of getting things going very quickly. If you know that you want to play an initial figure and then have that be a foundation for multiple cycles using that same content, you can just use multiply as a quick way to exit to exit record and go into multiply at the same time. That kind of idea. And here again, we can remultiply if we want to. Now we're back down to 4 cycles. We can use that as a new foundation. We can take this 4-cycle loop and multiply that out a few times. Let's go down to a 2-cycle loop. Or a 1-cycle loop. And so forth. Now let's talk about multi-increase. Multi-increase lets you tap in a specific number of cycles that you want the Echoplex to multiply your loop by, and then it will stop multiplying after it gets that many cycles. Here's our standard default loop. Now let's say I want this to be 8 cycles long. So what's going to happen is I'm going to press multiply to start multiply. I'm going to press it a second time, which ordinarily is going to start the rounding period. But if I start pressing multiply again within the rounding period, I'm going to start adding in additional multiples. So here we go. Multiply once, multiply a second time, and now we're adding in additional multiples with each successive press of the multiply button. And you saw over there that I pressed until I got up to C8, which meant cycles 8 cycles. So now the EDP is going to keep multiplying until it gets to 8 cycles, at which time it's going to stop. So this is useful if you know in advance exactly how many cycles you want to multiply out, and if you don't want to have to be sitting there and watching the controls and having to make sure that you hit multiply or overdub right within the window of the 8th cycle, or else you get the wrong number of cycles. So now we have an 8 cycle loop. We multiplied the initial loop out 8 times. Let me do all that again. Initial loop. Let's say I want this to be 4 cycles. So press multiply, press it a second time, and then each successive time I press it within the rounding period gives us another number of cycles that we can go up to. In that case, I multi-increased. Not a sentence you get to say every day. I multi-increased up to 4 cycles, and that meant that as soon as it got to the end of the 4th cycle, it stopped multiplying. Now let's talk about the long press of the multiply button, because it does a couple of different things depending on what's happening in the Echoplex when you do the long press. Here's a loop I built up off camera. So I'm going to do a long press of multiply, and I'm going to play over the top of this, and have a listen to what happens. Suddenly everything is completely different. So what happens is a long press of multiply puts you into what you could think of as substitute mode. Substitute is similar to replace, except that you can hear the loop as you're playing over it. You don't hear the change in the loop until it comes back around after you've done it. So long press. And now you can hear I covered up everything that was in that loop with what I was playing while I was doing the long press. And you can see the insert button actually lights up when you do the long press, because what you're doing is essentially an insert function. I'm going to do that a couple more times. That kind of idea. So this is more of a replace type of thing, but this is useful if you want to be able to do a substitute and either don't have it set up on your insert button or don't have an easy way of having access to it, or if you just want that kind of functionality, a long press of multiply will do that for you. Now, long press of record to clear out this loop. Let's talk about what happens when you do a long press of multiply when you're in the reset state. Long press of multiply resets every loop. That's only really important if you're using multiple loops. That means that all the other loops that are in memory, even if they're currently stored, are going to be erased. This is good if you finish a piece or a performance and you want to make sure that all of your different loops are cleared out and wiped free of memory before you begin with something else. So that's a crash course in multiply. We haven't talked about an unrounded multiply because that's such a big subject and such an important subject for me personally that I want to dedicate a separate video to it. But I want to start with standard multiply because you can't really talk meaningfully about an unrounded multiply until you've talked about a rounded multiply. So thank you for tuning in. This has been a crash course in part 1 of multiply. Stay tuned for part 2. Thank you so much.